I don't use the microphone?
Yes.
All right. So, can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'll go back one. So if you remember, if you were here in September, yes? You want to do that little preview thing? Somebody said to me that I needed to explain that subtitle, closer to thee than the vein in your neck. Right? And I said, well, it's from the Holy Quran, Surah 50. And the idea that's embedded in that is that for the faithful, God is immediately and intimately present. Yes, the carotid artery, that's what that's talking about, right? God is immediately and intimately present. And I want us to think about what that means for a moment. Because it actually is going to help us understand this journey that we're going to go on here. Remember what the word Islam means. It means submission to the will of God. The word Islam means submission to the will of God. A Muslim is one who submits to the will of God. And what's important to keep in mind as we start this is that in Islam, there is no area of life in which an individual does not submit to the will of God. You with me? Right? This idea that one's life is committed and devoted to following the will of God is fundamental to the faith. And when you think about this, remember that the devout Muslim's life is defined by that. The day, the week, the month, the year, and the life. Think about it. The devout Muslim prays 5 times a day. The devout Muslim's calendar is defined by the holy month of Ramadan. The devout Muslim's week is defined by the holy prayer day of Friday. The devout Muslim's life is defined by the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. The day, the week, the month, the year, the life. So, if your life is defined by this faith and relationship with God, you're not going to separate politics from religion. You can't. You can't. Right? When you think of this, notion of distinctions, we have this tendency to think about notions of separation in church and state. Right? The separation of church and state. In Islam, from its very beginning, there's been a conversation. A conversation about political authority, a conversation about religious authority, a complex conversation that doesn't lend itself really to monolith. And so, what I thought we would do is to take a bit of a journey through the history of this region and through the history of Morocco. And as I give you this overview and we go on this little bit of a journey, keep in mind, if you will, that time and again, I'll make reference not just to political leaders, but to religious authorities. Because there's a conversation that goes on throughout. And periodically as we go on this, I'll stop and provide you with a little bit of background. But I just wanted you to think about that. The relationship in Islam between individuals, the ummah, the community, and God. And how do we deal with matters that we would think of as state matters, political matters? All of those distinctions, how do we think about them? Well, let's keep this in mind as we go along here. So let's begin. So if you look up here, right, at this wonderful map, the spread of Islam, I guess the date on that one takes you up through 750 with the Common Era. And we look over there to the West African coast there, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, there's the Maghreb. Morocco. And there's that wonderful, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's on the map here on my computer, it's this wonderful green. Right? It looks like, okay, good. So here's our different chronological periods as Islam spreads across North Africa, breaks out of the Arabian Peninsula, by 711 is over the Iberian Peninsula, and here we have this great, wonderful green thing. Well, the conquest of the Maghreb begins in the 670s, the Common Era. Reaches Morocco and Spain about 711. But it's worth noting that the Arab presence in this early period is quite limited. In fact, there are garrisons known as rabats. And those garrisons were formerly occupied by the Byzantines. The Arabs had garrisoned themselves there. And the real folks that are on the ground, that are there both before the arrival of the Arabs and afterwards are, of course, nomadic and semi-nomadic Berber tribesmen. Many of those Berbers joined the ranks of Arab garrisons, converted to Islam, and helped to spread the faith into Morocco as well as into Spain. But there were others who did not join the garrisons. In fact, what they adopted was an interpretation and an understanding of political succession and political authority that is known as Kharijism, the Kharijite movement. So, if you can't, I'm going to try to stay away from the mic for a minute. Let me know if you can't hear me. Remember, if you will, that during the life of the prophet was both God's messenger as well as a political leader. He was a religious figure and a political one. And when he died, the question not of who's the next prophet was asked, because there was no other prophet. He was the final prophet. The question was a matter of political succession. Who's going to be his deputy? There were different answers that developed. It was a debate. You've heard the terms Sunni, Shia. Yes? And it's got all kinds of meaning that's attached to it today. Those were differences that began over the question of who should succeed the prophet politically. Should it be a member of his clan, his extended family? Should it be a member of his immediate family? That debate, we're not going to spend too much time on. But that's a fundamental conversation that happens. Who should succeed the prophet politically? Who should be the caliph? There were other answers besides the two. The Kharijite position was one that placed emphasis upon not the kinship, specifically, of a claimant to that position of successor, of deputy. Not kinship, but morality. Moral authority. And in this first phase, this earliest phase of Muslim expansion into the Maghreb, some Berbers adopted a Kharijite position. What's interesting about that, the scholars that focus on this, think about this, and they say when you really think about Berber tribesmen adopting a Kharijite position on this issue of political authority, what it allows them to do is to embrace Islam, but oppose Arab overlordship. What an interesting thing to think of here in the 7th century. Northern Morocco was the center, a cluster of Arab Berber principalities that will eventually become a Moroccan territorial state. One of the first that I want to introduce you to very quickly is the Idrisid regime. Founded at the old Roman capital of Volubilis by a descendant of Ali and Fatima, Prophet's daughter and son-in-law, who had escaped Arabia. Idris II founded the city of Fez, 808. The Idrisid kingdom was the first Moroccan Islamic state. It was a center of active conversion and proselytization on behalf of Islam. We're in the first decade of the 9th century of the Common Era. Actively engaged in converting the tribespeople, the Berber tribesmen, to Islam. It was really interesting. Apparently, there was a rival movement within the Berber tribal community in which a charismatic tribal leader essentially created his own version of Islam. Literally to try to challenge Idrisid authority. Of course, it didn't hold, but it's amazing to think about. Again, this notion of dynamic that's at play. His name was Salih ibn Tarif. He declared himself a prophet. He composed a book in Berber that he claimed was revealed. He established a set of behaviors and rules, basically establishing a Berber version of Islam. And of course, did not hold, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. There's a map of the region during the Idrisid era. In the Middle Ages, we have in Morocco a unified state. When I studied this as a student, I was quite captivated by it. Two dynasties that were involved, the Almoravid being the first. I have to admit that I didn't pay, as a student, close attention to the Moroccan roots to this very rich and dynamic medieval Islamic kingdom. So let's take a look at it. There's the Almoravid Empire. What was it? It was at its roots a coalition of Berber peoples that were united by religious leadership and by doctrine. The key figure in the early development of the Almoravid movement was a man named Yahya ibn Ibrahim. He went on pilgrimage to Mecca. Now you got to remember what going on the Hajj, what going on pilgrimage to Mecca is. It is an intensely personal, intimate, religious exercise and experience. And if you talk to a devout Muslim who's been on Hajj, you hear the deep emotion and the passion that such an exercise evokes. Pilgrimage and the impact that it has on people appears in the literature, in the chronicles, in the poetry and in the history of this region of the world over and over again because it is profound. I've never experienced it. I've read about it and I've heard folks talk about it. Is there anyone here that's been on Hajj? Have a conversation. If you get a chance, have a conversation. Well, Ibn Ibrahim went on pilgrimage to Mecca. He got back home to the Maghreb. He decided that God had called him to spread what he understood and had been revealed to him as the true practice of Islam. He brought with him a Moroccan student, a young man by the name of Abdallah ibn Yassin. Ibn Yassin was a scholar of Quran, of Hadith, the traditions of the Prophet, and of Islamic law. And Ibn Yassin got back to the Maghreb and he got back to Morocco and he called for repentance. And he warned that the end times were at hand. He emphasized the need for a strict moral and spiritual discipline. And what Ibn Yassin did in his teachings was he emphasized a distinction between inner and outer jihad. Now, you all heard of the word jihad, have you not? And we all have an understanding of what that word means, do we not? Yes? The waging of war. As I tell my students, the word jihad, as we understand it, waging war against the infidel, is a single definition of the term. The word means struggle. And if you study Quran, what you will find is there are more examinations and definitions and exploration of the word jihad, referring to the inner, internal struggle of the devout Muslim to live a life according to the will of God than waging war against the infidel. And notice what our friend Ibn Yassin says here. He says, look, what happens is you need to pay attention to the inner jihad. The purification of the body, the purification of the soul. You cannot wage proper external or outer jihad until you have triumphed internally. Until you're righteous. He founded a movement. Almoravid Empire. This term is rooted in Quran, in a term that refers to the way in which Muslim military units organize themselves to wage battle. It was a closed rank formation. So he names a movement after the term in Quran that refers to literally the way that the devout organize themselves into battlefield units, closed rank. And in particular, the reason he did that is because it ran counter to Berber tradition, which is rather than closed rank, which is what his movement is calling for, what Quranic battle is waged in. Berber military formations are long single lines that are stretched out. And he's thinking about jihad. Almoravid becomes Almoravid. Almoravid. And the name of this great medieval Islamic kingdom focuses on and is defined by waging holy war in a Quranically prescribed and authoritative way. I knew them as the Almoravids. The Almoravid dynasty
founds the city of Marrakesh as its capital in 1070. It expanded trade relations to facilitate and accelerate the conversion of Ghana to Islam. It conquered southern Spain. The Almoravids basically linked the Sahara, Morocco, and Spain into a new economic and social zone. And there are our friends, the Moroccans. In the period between the 11th and the 13th century, literally at the hub of a commercial, urbanized, sophisticated society. The Almoravids were narrowly defined religiously, but what they set up is a foundation for essentially a flourishing North African civilization in the High Middle Ages. It's brilliant. I use the word complexity. They're governing using a tribal aristocracy, Christian mercenaries, Spanish scribes. They're claiming the legitimacy of religious purity. They're bringing in legal scholars from the Maliki school. And then, let's see if I've got it. There it is. In the 12th century, they're bringing Andalusian style to great monumental construction and architecture. The Qarawiyin Mosque in Fez. Are you going to visit?
Yes.
When you go to Fez?
Yes.
You going to see it? Okay. This is Andalusian in design. For those of you not familiar with Andalusian and what that means, that refers to a kind of cultural style and a cultural fusion in Almoravid lands that is a fusion of Spanish Christian, of Berber, of Arab Muslim, and Jewish elements. When I was an undergrad in art history, we called it Mozarabic. It's brilliant. By the mid-12th century, the Almoravids are in decline. They are succeeded by the Almohad. The founding father of the Almohad dynasty was a scholar of Islam. Is there a trend beginning to develop here? Who went on pilgrimage to Mecca. Who studied in Baghdad and Damascus, great centers of medieval Islamic knowledge, jurisprudence, and philosophy. He came home and he began to preach reform. In his teachings, the founder of the Almohad dynasty emphasized the supremacy of the Quran and the supremacy of the Hadith, the traditions of the Prophet. He emphasized the transcendence and the oneness of God. He saw himself as the heir of the Prophet. He came to the point where he actually declared himself an infallible leader sent by God. He organized a new government out of the south of Morocco and established this dynasty. That founding father was succeeded by the greatest of the Almohad caliphs, Abd al-Mumin, who died in 1163. What did al-Mumin do? He conquered Morocco, he intervened in Spain, he invaded Algeria and Tunisia. He governed his empire using an executive council, a military aristocracy, a religious administration, and a civil bureaucracy modeled after Andalusian Spain. He died in 1163. But at the very time that this Almohad dynasty and culture is thriving, Islam is continuing to express itself in a variety of ways in the region. Through schools of law, particularly the Maliki, and through philosophy, and, most importantly, through Sufi mysticism. So what do we have here by the time that we get to the middle of the 13th century? What are we looking at? We're looking at dynasties that have used Islam and religious belief to legitimize themselves, to establish new political elites, and to unify the tribal Berber peoples. Islam has become the basis of political solidarity. The specifics of the way in which Islam is used and adapted varies from case to case. But all of them can claim first and foremost descent from the family of the Prophet. What about religious elites? Remember I said there's a conversation politically and religiously that's going on. I've already referred to one, the Maliki school. Remember that this idea that if indeed Islamic law as it's developed, Sharia as it develops, if it's going to be a guiding, determining, directing factor in people's lives, how do we understand it? How do we interpret it? How do we apply it? Those are very real questions. A school of legal interpretation and study that took off in Morocco and along West Africa was the Maliki school. Dynamic debates and considerations and studies of theological and legal issues, but we've got to remember that Maliki theologians and scholars are students of grammar and philology and math and astronomy and medicine. And then there's the Sufi tradition. Oh, I so desperately want to leave this microphone. It's making me crazy. The ascetic experience in human spirituality is universal. When I say that, what do I mean by the ascetic experience? The direct experience of the divine. You need look no further than, help me Charlene, the Benedictine monastery that's 2.5 hours away over in Alabama. Yes? Benedictine monasticism is a form of asceticism. What do? You limit the physical to empower the spiritual. Yes? You withdraw to engage the divine. That is powerful in Islam. It's called Sufism. And the Sufi ascetic tradition is diverse and it is rich. And throughout the history of Morocco and the Maghreb and Western Africa, it grows and it's prolific and it diversifies. And it becomes very important. Oh, I'm racing by. Remember that this intellectual and spiritual tradition that at times exists in association with political elites and other times outside of will continue to be an important player. And in particular, in the political history of Morocco, the power and the influence of the Sufi orders will be a real force as we enter modernity. After the collapse of the Almoravid and its successor dynasties, you've got, through the later Middle Ages, kind of an ebb and a flow politically. As we enter the early modern period, remember that Morocco, that had established this great commercial civilization there, connecting the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, sub-Saharan Africa with Spain, it gets into competition with the early modern European states. In the 14th and 15th century, Moroccan markets are welcoming ships from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Marseille, Catalonia, and Aragon. Morocco is importing metals, hardware, textiles, wool, spices, and wine, while she exports leather and hides and carpets, wool, coral, grain, slaves, and sugar. But the early modern Europeans are coming. The Portuguese, in the 15th century, are going to compromise Morocco politically and economically. The Portuguese don't invade per se, but you see that arrow, you see those arrows, right? They establish a presence off the coast, and it has an impact. And as the political center of Morocco is weakened in the early modern period, the leadership of Sufi brotherhoods becomes more important. At the local level, it's Sufi leaders that build tribal coalition, association, and institutionalization. They become decentralized centers of authority. And at the same time that this is going on, a new tradition develops in Morocco in the early modern period that you need to be aware of. An idea coalesces around the authority of the Sultan, in which the argument goes something like this. The authority of the ruler is not just based upon imitation of the prophet, but the key thing is that notion of descent. That descent of from the prophet's family assures a certain degree and amount of religious sanctity. Those who are in political power, who are the descendants of the prophet, are the Shurafa. They're already privileged in society. They're already supported by the religious endowments and organizations. But during this period, the Shurafa are able to establish the idea that because of their status as descendant from the line of the prophet, that they have, listen to it, a moral right to lead politically. It takes hold. Moroccan Sufis and princes from this point forward will claim Sharifian descent, and it becomes the hub of political legitimacy. Closer to thee than the vein in your neck. By 1400, Morocco has a central state regime and a Sufi-led rural population. The Saadian dynasty rules in Morocco from 1554 to 1659. The greatest of this dynasty is Sultan al-Mansur, who dies in 1603. He really is the one who organizes the dynasty and the regime. Listen to what he bases his legitimacy upon. His administrative efficiency, a blessing that he has received thanks to his Sharifian descent, his dynastic inheritance, and his elective authority, his legitimacy in the eyes of the tribes, the city, and the army. It's all there. The dynasty will collapse in the middle of the 17th century. But here's the thing. That collapse will lead to the rise of the Alawi dynasty. And ladies and gentlemen, the ruler, the monarch of Morocco today is a descendant of the Alawi. They will come to power based upon their religious legitimacy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Sufi brotherhoods and Sufi power continues to grow. As the Europeans in the late 19th century, there we go, are expanding and increasing their economic and political penetration and influence and power in Africa. The center weakens, but it doesn't go away. Eventually, the French and the Spanish will establish protectorates in Morocco in 1912. The French resident general basically is going to carry out, in the 20th century, in the interwar period, is going to carry out a basic policy that's pro-French. The legal scholars and the Sufi leaders are going to come to be seen as failing under the pressure to sufficiently fight the French. So in the 1920s, a reform movement begins, a religious reform movement. This particular generation of reformers will focus on education. They will open schools teaching Arabic grammar, ethics, logic, Islamic history, arithmetic. They will emphasize theologically the purification of Islam and the defense against Western cultural encroachment. You see how those two things come together? You see that? Keep that in mind. The reform priorities and energies really took root and accelerated when French policies hurt local, native, what we would call kind of middle-class folks. Think about this for a moment. That's Casablanca. You're going to go to Casablanca? Okay. In the period from 1925 to 1940, the city of Fez suffered a debilitating economic collapse and depression. Why? Because not just European competition, but because the Europeans had focused upon the use and the buildup of Casablanca as a port and business center. You see, Fez has been around since 800. By 1926, you've got political groups forming around these schools, and an independence movement begins as early as 1934. The reformers are presenting to the French a program to basically establish, ultimately, Moroccan independence. It began as religious reform. The French refused, there were protests in 36 and 37, and then the Second World War occurred. After World War II, interestingly enough, the Sultan, Mohammed V, became the focal point of independence. The reason that he became the focal point of independence is because he refused to go along with French initiatives to suppress an independence party in Morocco. He wouldn't sign on. When he continued to buck the French, he was forced into exile. And when he went into exile, Sultan Muhammad became a martyr. The French and their allies were forced to concede. Protests turned into violence. They brought him back and negotiated the creation of an independent Morocco. It was signed on March 7th, 1956. In 1957, with the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, Sultan Muhammad V became King Muhammad V. A scholar of this region wrote, and he's brilliant, in Morocco, and I quote Professor Lapidus, Islam is still so closely identified with the monarchy and the state that it constitutes nothing less than a Moroccan national identity. In the life of the devout Muslim, the presence of God is intimate. He is closer to thee than the vein in your neck. In the life and the history of Morocco, ladies and gentlemen, Islam is closer to it than its metaphorical vein in its neck. For those of you that are traveling, have a whale of a time. Enjoy it. Thank you all very much.